We're going to be picking up in the 16th book of Yisrayl. Before we get started, when we look at the situation that we have going on in the world today, there's a lot of calamity, uncertainty, destruction, to say the least. I was having a conversation with one of the brothers, one of the great deacons earlier today, and even if Yahweh was to allow things to come to a sudden halt at this particular time, like if the bombs were to drop and everything, we can say that we've seen the fulfillment of a lot of the things that are to be occurring in these last days. We know that earthquakes, specifically earthquakes in place after place, which means unnatural disasters, or unoriginal disasters, because things can be natural, when mankind causes there to be the mixing of genetic information. It comes out natural. As a matter of fact, there's a huge debate right now as to what constitutes organic. A pastor has said so many times, he's like, these are the things that they really argue about, and they really spend a lot of time debating about, what organic is. And it should be so blatantly obvious, to all of the world what organic actually is. It's unprofaned food that has not been profaned. And of course, to profane means to take out of its original state. That's, or to alter. To take out of its proper state. That's what profane is. So when the scripture speaks about profaning the Sabbath day, that means that we have effectively taken the Sabbath day out of its original, what Yahweh originally planned for the Sabbath day, and turned it into something else. So that's what we see even today with the Seventh-day Adventists, all the Seventh-day assemblies. Though they keep the Sabbath on Saturday, it's not Yahweh's Sabbath. Because Yahweh's Sabbath is also predicated upon keeping all of the other Sabbaths, which are Yahweh's, the beginning and the ends of Yahweh's feast days, and also the sighting of Yahweh's moon on the Feast of Trumpets. So we're going to pick up here on page 170. We're going, and this is chapter 16. It's the Pope, who is being worshipped by all the world, is bringing forth wars contrary to what he says. Soon you will see the depopulation. And these things that are occurring in the world right now is all part of this depopulation. Pastor said that it's a planned thing. They're planning these wars. They planned for the river Euphrates, as it shows in Revelations, to be dried up to make way for the kings of the east. If you remember, the great river Euphrates dried up, and then soon after there was a huge influx of refugees pouring into Europe. And part of the issue was that the great river Euphrates had dried up, and there was many, 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 many people who relied on the water that came from the river Euphrates. But there was a plan. If you go back and listen to the things that Pastor brought out about the refugees and everything that has been occurring in Europe, you'll see that it's been something that was planned and executed. And it's by the kings of the east, and the one who rules over the kings in the east, who is the Catholic Church. And people are starting to realize more and more that the Catholic Church has a lot to do with a lot of the issues that are going on in the world. And pastors brought that out, of course, over his whole time of uncovering and the scriptures refers to pastor as the disputer of this age, the one who disputes the teachings that come forth from the 7 hills of Rome. So if you'll we'll pick up on verse 2, which is on page 170. Pastor says, the news today, I think, is absolutely wonderful. The whole world is now learning lessons that were in Yahweh's plan. Okay, the plan for mankind to be permitted to go his own way. Okay, Yahweh started putting this plan in motion in Genesis. Okay, this plan of making man into the image and likeness of Yahweh, Genesis 1:26, allowing them to follow after Genesis 3 and verse 5. Okay, and then in the latter portion, bringing forth this organization of which we are sitting in right now, that will usher in the coming of this kingdom, this city which is newly named Jerusalem. Okay, the new Jerusalem. In other words, the new city of peace is not the same one that was of old. Okay, within the confines of the hills of Sinai and Zion and Moriah. But this last day's work, this last day's Jerusalem, is going to be here at Abel, the city of peace, where the teacher of peace resides. Okay, so it says Yahweh didn't bring this stuff on them. They brought it on themselves. And that's what we see here, is that the Pope and those whom he is sending out to spread the message, okay, to spread the good news of the Catholic Church, they are the ones who are actively performing these things, actively causing these things, everything that you see, to come to pass. Okay, it all rests squarely on the shoulders. Right now we see so much going on in the world concerning the sexual misconduct of the people in Hollywood, which Pastor has been teaching against and disputing the institute in Hollywood for as long as he's been preaching this message, going against what Hollywood has been bringing out, and now we're seeing the result of it. There's at least 24 high-powered individuals at this time have been openly implicated in sexual misconduct. Okay, but these are, these are the chickens coming back to roost, or the hens coming back to roost, right? Off of what they thought was such a wonderful thing, but now it's turning out to be such a horrible, calamitous endeavor, which is Hollywood. Verse 3, it says, this article was just handed to me, and I was as I was coming in. Living bacteria are riding the Earth's air current. Even this is what we've been teaching now for 40 years or more, and telling why the climate is changing, why the Earth is changing. High-flying microbes can travel across the globe, spreading diseases and changing the climate. Okay, and again, the wildfires that were taking place in California just recently, the most recent ones, that are still raging right now. They've said that they've got some of them under control, but under control doesn't mean that they stopped. Okay, the fires there's still fires raging, but here in Abelin, we were experiencing some of that, the ashes drifting over and falling over Abelin. Okay, the weathermen have been making statements about and showing how the air currents go from California all the way across the U.S. Okay, the lower 2/3 of the United States of America was affected by the wildfires that were going on in California. So, Pastor showing here that these microbes have the ability to travel. Again, we already know, because we follow after the teachings of the one sent, But just to give us more ammunition, this is a perfect example of how far and wide microbes can travel. And they go further than, for a microbe to go from one end of the United States to the other end is just a hop, skip, and a jump. That's nothing. I feel like going over to Florida. Where are you at? California. Just jump on a current, an air current. All right, I'll see you there. I'll be over there in just a little bit. Right? So it says this is proven now by science. Just like Yahweh said, praise Yahweh. Here's another one. If your trust is in the doctors, you might ought to pay attention. Why you want to eat more salt, not less, to lower the risk of heart attacks. Okay, so more salt to lower the risk of heart attacks. That's the reason. For years, we've been told to cut down on our salt intake to lower the risk of high blood pressure and heart attacks. But what if cutting down on salt made you more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke? In a current study, 3,600 men and women, researchers found a current study of 3,600 men and women, researchers found that 1/3 of the participants with the lowest salt intake were actually 66% more likely to suffer a heart attack or a stroke. That is absolute facts. How can this be? Lower sodium levels can also increase your resistance to insulin and affect your nervous system, including your heart rate. If sodium levels fall too low, it can damage your cardiovascular system. Check with your doctor. Well, they checked with their doctors, and he's the one that caused them to have a heart attack. Okay? The hospitals, the doctors, remember Pastor said plainly that the doctors don't know medicine, okay, or they don't actually heal. The doctors practice medicine, and they practice on you and me. Okay, they experiment, and they experiment on you and me. Okay, it's the same thing with the judicial system. The judicial system in America, they don't know exactly what they're doing. That's why the latest elections that just went on, there was two transgender politicians that were just put into office. Okay? This is practicing. They're practicing their way. They don't have any full knowledge of the right way, the right and proper way to conduct themselves. Yahweh said that your king must obtain for himself a copy of Yahweh's law, and henceforth must read it each and every day. Okay? This is what Yahweh said that our rulers need to do. Okay, but what we see in the world today is that anything goes. And part of that anything goes is the depopulation, because if trans individuals who are transgender can become our leaders, then they're going to push certain ideals onto our children, and our children are going to grow up having a very awkward existence, to say the least. Okay, and just accepting everything. If you just accept everything, then you give yourself over to the curses that come from the accepting of everything. So here it is in verse 6. Pastor says, I like that thing they showed on the news. Every once in a while, they break it down and show you some great things. This guy is driving down the highway, and he sees a sign posted that pain in your arm is real. This kind of wakes him up a little, and he straightens up and rubs his arm. Then he drives a little further down, drives a a little further, and another sign says, "This is no joke. You're having a heart attack." The next sign was a hospital. "Go see your doctor. He'll tell you to get off salt." No. He was already at the doctor's. Now he has to go back again, okay, because he got off of the salt. But Pastor's going to show us here exactly who are the ones who actually guided and directed the doctors, who actually taught the doctors to behave in the manner that they're behaving in today. Because it's all about money. Everything is all about money. Okay? And we know already that a bribe perverts justice. Okay? Perverts justice. Verse 7. Here's something else that the scriptures told you about 710 BY. A single drop of blood can determine every virus you've ever had. Not every virus that you have, but every virus that you have ever had. Past tense. Okay? And of course, if you think about, certain concepts of vaccinations and everything, you'll understand the principle. Vaccinations are wrong, but they have a specific principle, okay, that has some merit to it. But, putting an individual, putting a sickness into an individual, hoping that his body will build a resistance to it, that's not the way to protect an individual's life. But Pastor says here, where would they get that? They get it from your blood vessels. They get the blood from the blood vessels. Yahweh told us about that Yahweh told us about in Isaiah 65 verses 2-7. They're a rebellious nation that is creating viruses, and they're floating around in their bloodstream. It's a virus scan screens the blood for antibodies against 206 species of viruses that are known. Okay? Those are just the ones that are known. Now, this is not the best virus scans. There's one that's better than this. They found that an average person has been exposed to 10 of the 206 viruses. However, some showed exposure to more than double that amount, and many of those people have probably been infected with many different strains of the same virus, and it would show up as one hit. So if you have one virus, one family of viruses, it could be many different versions of that same virus, but it'll show up as just one. So Pastor says here, the herpes virus is one of them that they're getting ready to put these viruses in the water now to kill all the fish. And if you remember that story, there was an individual who wanted to use the herpes virus in order to kill off a particular fish in some of the fishing areas. It says they'll grind them up and sell them back to the person for fertilizer. And this shows how confused this world is. That's another thing that the scriptures said. This one now, all viruses that infect animals or people can be detected in a single new test. A new super sensitive test called ViroCap. Okay, so we had VirScan or VirScan. Now we have ViroCap, which is supposed to be more powerful, able to detect more. Can detect thousands of viruses that make people and animals sick in their blood. Yahweh says, floating around. Hepatitis C deaths hit an all-time high in the United States. Almost 20,000 people died from hepatitis C in 2014, an all-time high, the CDC says. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention announced yesterday surpassing the total combined deaths from 60 other infectious diseases, including HIV. What's that? That's pneumococcal disease and tuberculosis. 2010 to 2014, new cases of hepatitis C infections more than doubled. We estimate the numbers of new infections is closer to 30,000 per year, Ward says. So both deaths and new infections are on the rise. Just recently, one of the priests was telling me about in one of the countries to the east of us, that they have a ritual where you remember what Pastor was saying about President Trump putting blood onto the bullets because the Muslims believe that they have to be clean when they die, right? Okay. Well, part of that, when a Muslim person dies, they have to go through a ritual bathing. Okay, every Muslim is supposed to do this. They go through a ritual bathing, and they get wrapped in linen, and then they're presented to be buried after prayer and ceremony and all of these different things. And it's supposed to be a close family member that's supposed to be doing the bathing of the body. Well, in this country, they go a step further. They dig up the dead and bathe them again and change all of their wrappings and everything like that. So there was in the last year, there's been a huge epidemic of the Black Plague. There's been thousands of people who have died, and people's limbs are rotting off. Okay, people's limbs are literally rotting off. And it's an explosion of this epidemic that's occurring in that country. So these are some of the things that we see that occur when we don't keep Yahweh's law. Over to verse 16, in the 16th book of Yisrayl, it says, in 1 Timothy 1:1, Shaul, an apostle of Yahshua Messiah, by commandment of Yahweh. That should be by the law of Yahweh. Okay, and we know that it is by Yahweh's law. That's what this work was doing, taking the law of Yahweh to Rome, which was where the elders of the 12 tribes, or the heads of Jacob, moved to. In verse 2, to Timothy, a true child in the faith. Look down to verse 5 now, to the ultimate result of the law that he's speaking of in this verse, in verse 1. The ultimate result of the law, okay, the ultimate result of keeping Yahweh's law is love out of a pure heart, a clear conscience, an unfeigned, genuine faith. Okay, an unfeigned, genuine faith. We should all take those examples, the end result of Yahweh's law, the ultimate result, and really meditate on it. Meditate on what it means. Don't just read it and, allow our minds to just kind of gloss over it. But read it and really meditate on what those things really mean. Okay? Love out of a pure heart. What does it mean to have a pure heart? Look it up. Find it out. Right? And then fashion ourselves in that image. And also find out what it means. Okay, look it up. Find out what a clear conscience is. Also find out what unfeigned, genuine faith is. Okay, so these things will help us in our walk with Yahweh. Let's go over to verse 24. It says, well, in 2 Timothy, in verse 3, in speaking of this, that we just saw in the news, he said, know this also, that in the last days perilous times would come. Okay, a time period that would be like no other. There's no other time parallel to this one. That's why when we began, I said that if Yahweh was to allow things to go right now, these things have been fulfilled. This time period right now, we've been protected. We haven't seen We haven't identified all the things that are going on in this world today. But when you just look at some tiny, tiny examples of what's going on in this world, it's flabbergasting. It's amazing. You know, in Hollywood right now, they're uncovering their their folly. Let's go over to page 174, and let's pick up on a topic that Pastor has mentioned many times previous, which is Malachi Martin. Okay, this is in verse 45. So page 174, verse 45. Malachi Martin, in his book, even wrote this in his speeches. He brought out loud and clear that the Pope, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the divining serpent, hopes to come out on top. They're going to have this mass slaughter, and the goddess, the Queen of Heaven, he calls her Mary, said she's going to make war with everyone who will not worship her. That's in the book, The Keys of This Blood. And in that book, just like what Pastor said, it's a hard read. It's not an easy read. But there's some things that are shown in The Keys of This Blood that we're seeing the fruits of it right now. Everything that's going on in Hollywood right now with all the sexual misconduct that's being exposed, it's also shown in The Keys of This Blood. Okay? So it says here in verse 46, the keys of this blood that he was talking about is the scepter. That same scepter spoken of in Genesis 49. It's the scepter that Yahweh holds, and they know this. They know this. Okay, the Catholic Church knows it too. They know that what they said is they have apostolic succession. Okay, which means that they succeed the apostles. They know that they have that bloodline. Okay? And Pastor shows us plainly what the Egyptian Catholic Coptics, what they're about. Okay? Let's go over to verse, because we see how Pastor shows that Francis offered his version of a Europe that cares for children, the elderly and the poor and the infirm, as well as those newcomers seeking acceptance because they have lost everything they need for shelter. But Pastor said plainly in the beginning that it's all a farce. Okay, when they say, you know, that in the beginning it says the Pope who is who is being worshipped by the world today brings forth wars contrary to what he says. And here in verse 48 on page 175, it says here that the Pope cares for the children and he's speaking about the refugees at this point. But he's the same one who's bringing their demise and their depopulation. Remember what so many weeks ago was brought out concerning Rome, that Rome was kicking the refugees out of the squares and the public areas in Rome. Okay, and that's the seat of the Catholic Church. So if this is occurring right under their nose, right under their seat, imagine what they'll do intentionally. The system is beyond repair. The only one who can repair this system is Yahshua Messiah and this work that's going on in these last days, which encompasses all of you. Praise Yahweh. Let's go to verse 57. It says, I wanted to turn over to Revelations in verse 8. These ties you in with the time of the witnesses. Revelations 11 is where Yahweh gives the two witnesses their authority. We know these things, and we glorify Yahweh in the understanding that he has given us. And at this time, if you'd all please stand. I'd like to turn the floor over to my beloved brother, the great Kahan Kananya Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, saints of Yahweh. You may be seated. All right. So now we're going to continue for those who might be just joining us here on TV land or radio land. I don't know if you can get it on the radio or if anybody came in late. We're in the 16th book of Yisrayl, Sea of Glass, and we're in chapter 16. We're not on page 16, in case you're wondering if we're going to keep on with that. But we're on, this sermon is entitled, "The Pope who is being worshipped by all the world is bringing forth wars contrary to what he says. Soon you will see the depopulation." It was from Sermon 5/7/2016. And you see the characteristics of this man. But remember, the Pope is, he's kind of like the President of the United States. The President is not the one that makes all the decisions. It's the beast that's behind him, the Vatican that's behind the Pope, that divining serpent, is telling him what to do. Just like the United States, the president does have some authority and some say, some veto powers in certain things, but there's a whole system, a kingdom that's behind him that's making a lot of decisions on the everyday basis. And you see that, what he says is contrary to what he's doing. And Yeshua spoke of them. He says, "You hypocrites." Even Yachanan warned him. He said, "You hypocrites, who has warned you to flee, from these things? Who's told you to come here and start hearing what we're saying?" And their hypocrisy has gone on all the way from the time of Cain and his turning from Yahweh and the laws of Yahweh. Remember, he was taught just like Abel, the laws of Yahweh, and he went the path of that mixture of righteousness and evil. He didn't stick with the tree of life that was taught to him, and everyone has gone the way of Cain in these last days. Nimrod created a system that spread out throughout the whole world, and he was able to actually make people pay to learn how to kill themselves through colleges and medical professions and things like this. And, remember, it's a mixture of righteousness and evil. Yes, there's some benefit there. Yes, there's some benefit in certain other things, but it's not the original way that Yahweh created to begin with. If mankind would have stuck with what Yahweh gave him from the beginning, then he would have no need for anything else. He wouldn't have no need for going to the hospital. He wouldn't have a need for, getting a retroviral shot or a massive shotgun blast of antibiotics to counteract the STDs that have accumulated in his body because of the sexual sins he's partaken in, or the diseases that have come up in his digestive system or any other place in his on his body, inside or outside, because of the unclean foods that he's eaten. Mankind will have no need for any of these things. But Yahweh warned him. He said, "I will show you what your end will be." Right? But he let them go their way. Nothing that they purpose to do will be withheld from them. This was the gods and also mankind who followed after the gods. Well, if you back up here a little bit on page 175, Francis was going to be given this this award here, this peace award, and he's talking about this this letter that he was given in this speech that he was kind of given, saying, this is what we need to do to kind of get Europe back in line here. And then back up to verse 47, he says, echoing the famous "I Have a Dream" speech by U.S. civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., Francis offered his vision of a Europe that cares for children. But don't judge all these sodomites now that the Vatican are raping these children and throwing their bodies into graves. Don't say anything about that. And this pastor's saying that. The Pope wasn't saying that. Who am I to judge them people? Now, you've got to keep this in mind, or you can be led away by this deception that is being brought forth in this letter. In verse 48, he says, Francis offered his vision of a Europe that cares for children. So he offers a vision. This is something he sees one day that this will take place, acknowledging even in his letter that it is not taking place in Europe. There is no care for the children there. There's no care for the elderly, the poor, and the infirm, as well as those newcomers seeking acceptance. Well, they're not taught to care. They're not taught the ways of peace. They're not taught love for your neighbor. They were taught, remember, those laws were done away with. Jesus nailed them to the stake. And there's no need. You're saved by grace. All you have to do is just believe. And the more you sin, the more the Lord's grace will fall upon you, brother. And this is, imagine coming from the standpoint of somebody who, you think of the mentality of mankind, and for the most part, except for a select few, mankind, or I'll say the carnal mind, is like water. It takes the path of least resistance. And so, you have this on one hand. Well, you've got to keep these laws. You can't eat this, you can't touch that. You must do this on this day. Or you have just belief. All you got to do is love. Huh. Well, that sounds easy enough. Well, sign me up. And it's a deception that's come forth. But yes, what Yahweh has for mankind, this is why he calls it a work. He calls it a work because it's not just something that we're doing to accomplish a task, but it is also something we have to work at in overcoming our sins and getting rid of the carnality and getting rid of the God worship, the lust, the foolishness, tearing down the pillars that were built up in our minds, these gods that were built up in our minds when we lived and we dwelt in Egypt. And the children of Israel went through the same thing. They said, we had pots of meat and leeks and not plumbing leaks, but they had leeks and onions and garlic. We had all these things. And now you brought us out here in this desolate waste place, Moshe, to let us just die, and we have to starve, and we have to actually lift our hands to get something done? Where's my maids? But it was a work that Yahweh was preparing, and they didn't even see the great opportunity that they had in being a part of this great plan to bring forth in that time period our high priest and Savior Yeshua Messiah. And in addition to that, the one sent who will come almost 2,000 years later in the time period which would be considered the end, that all the prophets and the apostles, they all wrote and talked about that time period. And even the second book of Yisrayl, the second part or part 2 of the book of Yahweh was written for us. They didn't have it. Yana, Isaiah, Samuel, all those men, they didn't have the second part. That came in for us. That came after Yeshua Messiah, with the apostles writing those things. And that's our foundation, if you remember. So in verse 49, he's talking about the surge of immigrants. He's saying, it's promoted by the threat of terrorism. Terrorism is causing them to flee their countries, these immigrants who are leaving and trying to find some refuge in the European countries because they're close to that area right there. So, they're not going to, try to boat all the way over the United States and Canada and South America and things like that. That's the place that's closest to them right there, the European countries. And they're trying to find refuge, but, as we've seen on the news many, many times, they're being rejected there too. This is because, and if you remember what Yeshua said in verse 24 of Matthew, which we have it all, we have it all by heart, but he says, in verse 12, he says, and because iniquity, the breaking of Yahweh's laws will abound, the love of many will grow cold. You think about the coldness of heart of people who don't want other people who are suffering at the hands of war, suffering their homes being blown to pieces. I think it was one of the reports we showed. I think it was the Rohingya refugees. Anyway, the lady was saying that they came in. I think it was some of the Myanmar troops that came in, and they were shooting up the villages and torturing the people and beating them up and everything. So the people ran into the jungle to kind of hide from them. And the lady said we would have went back to our homes after they left, but after they ran into the jungle, they came in and they burnt their homes down to the grounds. So they said we had no other place to go. They burnt our crops. We had nothing to do. We had no food. We had no homes to go to. It's not like they burned your crops. Well, I'll go ahead and plant another seed, and maybe in another day or two I'll have something to eat. It takes months and months for these things to take place, and it could be destroyed in an instant. So they went and tried to find them a place of refuge, and of course, a lot of these places are turning them away. But he says terrorism is causing them to flee their country, speaking of the refugees. And he says terrorism, those are the ones they're talking about trying to protect themselves from being killed off. They're trying to protect their land and their wealth. They're trying to protect their wives and their children. And that's kind of twofold there, because it's terrorism that's causing the refugees to to come out or be kind of forced out of their countries. But on the other hand, you have these groups that are engaging in terrorist acts against the United States and other governments because they're tired of being taken advantage of. They're tired of seeing their families and their homes destroyed, so they're retaliating. Now, of course, that doesn't solve the problem, we know. But this is also prophesied in Genesis chapter 14 that it will be continual war, vengeance, and retaliation, the way of Cain. They've got a little bit of holiness there, but the rest of it is filled with the mixture of righteousness and evil. So they're going to do what they've been trained to do, and that's fight back. That's to fight back. They'll see very, very soon that fighting doesn't solve the problem, and they'll be joyous to come to Yahweh's house and to receive His peaceful solution, and they'll learn war no more. And they'll actually, at that point, they'll begin to enjoy the rest of Yahweh in their minds, in their bodies, and everything. Think about the peace of mind that a person has. We're kind of spoiled here in the United States because we watch the news and we see the things taking place in other countries. But we're going to have a lot of people who come out of that, the 2 billion, the majority of that 2 billion that come out of that, they will have had firsthand experience of, not knowing if they're going to wake up to a home or wake up at all in the morning. Because is there going to be a missile that flies out of the sky? Are tanks going to come through and take us out? Are soldiers going to come in and ravish all our women and daughters and kill the men and loot everything of value that we have? And they will have experienced these things, and it'll be a testimony to them and to us as well as we sit and talk with them, because as we grow in positions, a lot of them may be your counselees one day. You may be baptizing and doing baptism counseling with a lot of these people one day. 2 billion people is a lot of people. 2 billion people is a lot of people. 100,000 people are a lot of people. That's the size of Abelin trying to come here to this 44 to keep the feast. Imagine that. Yeah, they can't all fit on the 44, but imagine the soup line. You better get there early. Otherwise, it's going to be some slim pickings. It's going to be like that soup that Pastor said that his mom used to make. You had to hunt for that chicken. Well, you'd be hunting for something at the bottom of the bowl. But no, Yahweh's going to provide. Yahweh promises us that we will grow fatter. We won't hunger, we won't thirst anymore. And so much is being done right now to prepare for that, because we have to do the work. And in order to do the work, we have to eat. We have to eat. We have to drink. Yahweh wants us, Pastor wants us to be able to rejoice. And this is why so many things are being prepared right now, so that we can continue in that work when this time period or this next phase comes. But let's see here. Let's look over to verse 54 here. He says, "Now the woman from Germany," I believe he's talking about Angela Merkel. There's another thing you need to connect with the scriptures. In these last days, women will rule over them, and children will be their oppressors, which the children are. Right now, the children are oppressors. Talk to any teacher. We have opportunity quite a bit when we have to go into the schools, or we're asked to come to the schools and teach the peaceful solution. And you really have a sit-down talk with these teachers, the guidance counselors, the administrators, and you get them to really have a heart-to-heart with you. They're frustrated. They're just ready to throw their hands up. They got into it not because teachers are, six-figure income. You really have to love what you do to want to teach. You have to love children. You have to love to want to benefit and make a difference in a person's life. And for the most part, that's what most teachers want to do, because they're getting children at a time period, they're getting people, humans, at a time period where they can sometimes be the most difficult. And we all were there once. We all were 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15, 16, 17, 18. We were there once. Well, so those who are men were. Some haven't gotten there yet. And children kind of go from that phase when they're 3 and 4 and 5, and you ask them, who did this or what was this? They go from the I don't know phase to when they get into the teenager to I know. And then at that point, they know it all. And the teachers, they get the majority of the time, 9 months or so out of the year, maybe a little bit less than that with the holidays and everything, to work with these children. And it can be very, very difficult, especially right now with sin being at its peak and all the distractions that come from media devices, telephones, laptops, tablets, all these things, influences that draw the children's mind away from learning. They want to do anything but learn, the great many of them. But he says, children are their oppressors. They have no answers for the problem, and they're trying to copy the House of Yahweh and the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program in their ads. If you watch the news closely, you'll see this, or if you've read the news closely, you'll see it, but they will not bring forth the full law of Yahweh. They want to kind of draw off of and wean off of the pieces that they can find benefit in, but they want to throw the rest of it away. It's kind of like when they find a herb that has properties that'll fight cancer or shrink tumors or stop inflammation. Well, the herb, a person can go and they plant a seed and grow it in their backyard and they can eat it. Oh, there's no money in that. Let's draw off of the elements of that herb, mix it with some other synthetic ingredients, patent it, and now we can sell this as a drug for hundreds of dollars a dose. As compared to a pepper that you can go and pull out of your garden and eat for literally pennies. Right? The love of money is a root of all evil. And, Yahweh warns us against that. Money, all money is worth the ink that is printed on right now. And actually, the ink is probably more valuable than the actual value of the dollar. But in page 176, he says, at the very top there on page of the last part of verse 57, he says, you see the works or the actions of these works of Yahweh, the ordained works of Yahweh that were prophesied. They were prophesied, and then Yahweh said through a Moshe, there would be no others except those that are prophesied. So you've got the Catholic Church here, you have the Vatican, and you have Pope Francis, who is the spokesperson, the little horn for that organization or that kingdom that's bringing forth the way of Cain. And then on the other side, you have the kingdom of Yahweh, the tree of life, and Yahweh's trumpet, Yahweh's spokesperson, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins, who's bringing forth the message of life or the laws of Yahweh. And the thing that's an indicator to us that this is the right place is prophecy. Because Yahweh's always shown these things through prophecy. He says he will tell you in advance, so that when these things come to pass, you will know that there was a prophet among you. And here in this time period, we're seeing things unfolding right now, and we know that we have a great teacher, a leader, who has foretold because it was given. What he's doing, he's rehearsing the words of the prophets. He's foretelling these events. And then as Isaiah said, it was given to them, the two witnesses, to foretell these events. Nobody else has authority to do it. You have people who will get on television and they'll pretend like they know the words of the scriptures. They'll try, and really some of them I do think that they really do try and they want to understand some things. But unless they submit themselves to the house of Yahweh and the priest, they'll never gain that understanding, you see. But if they do that, that means they're going to have to give up this, all right? Because in their church, they have a collection plate, and that brings in the money. And something's got to pay for the BMW, You can't just believe. You should tell them, how am I going to make my BMW pay? Well, just believe, maybe love will do it. Yeah, well, that don't work. Look at verse 60. He says in verse 2, and I saw 7 Malachim who stood before Yahweh, They're still standing there. And like Pastor was saying, this wasn't like they were standing like I'm standing right here before you. But in the plan of Yahweh, these works were before Yahweh, and the representatives who were there, those 7 works are still before Yahweh. Remember that menorah that we see on set up and lit on the Sabbath days are a representation of the plan of Yahweh. and that is at Yahweh's right hand, that stands before him in the house of Yahweh. You know, where you had the example of the tabernacle in the wilderness, which was just a pattern of the heavenly. You know, Yahweh he doesn't dwell in houses made by hands. You know, it couldn't contain them. In fact, Yahweh, the full effect of Yahweh's dwelling is in his people. And it's seen through our works. It's seen through our actions. It's seen how we conduct ourselves, think, reason, and so forth, as Genesis 1:26 says. But Yahweh is a being. I'm not saying Yahweh, he's not. He is a man. But as the children of Yahweh, he is seen through us. When we rule as he rules, when we govern as he governs, and so forth. So in verse 61, in verse 2, and I saw the 7 Malachim who stood before Yahweh, and to them were given 7 trumpets. I will give to my 2 witnesses. Remember that. Well, you've got the same word that is here. The 7 trumpets, the 7 works of teaching. Whoever Yahweh wanted to hear, whoever he gave ears to hear, as Yeshua put it, he who has an ear, let him hear. That doesn't mean the ear, an ear that's on your head. It means understanding. If you have an ear, you have understanding. And so it's kind of like a statement, but like a question. If you have an ear, hear. Or if you have an ear to understand, then you'll understand what I'm saying. Not if you have an ear, well, I've got 2. I should have twice the understanding. No, you have to have understanding from Yahweh, which comes by first him already, if you remember, preordaining you before the foundations of the earth were ever laid to be called to be a son of Yahweh. So this was already laid long before there was ever a heaven and an earth. Before there was dirt to put your feet on or anything like that. Yahweh preordained each and every one of us here. Now some come and they, like Yahweh's sons, leave their first estate, but that's their doing. Yahweh wants to see what's in their heart. He wants to see what their choice is going to be. But once he calls you here and he starts guiding you in the laws of Yahweh and you start receiving the message and so forth, and you start grasping and understanding these things, then that spirit of understanding starts to grow stronger and stronger in you. And it's the same thing that's asked from the courts of heaven when the priest, bless you and lay hands on you after your baptism. That Yahweh will give you a greater spirit of understanding so that you will grow in the knowledge of the laws of Yahweh and the plan of Yahweh. But keep that in mind there. Like Yachanan 5:30 says, I of my own self, Yeshua said, I of my own self can do nothing. And I think it's in 6 verse 44 of Yachanan, which says, no man can come to me unless the Father draws him. Speaking of Yeshua, So all of this has to come through authority from the kingdom of heaven. You being here, me being here, all of us being here in the house of Yahweh, the 2 billion that are going to come eventually is done through the authority, permission being granted, everything laid out perfectly, down to the very number and when the people come out, when each and every one of us comes out, and Yahweh's saying, in order for this to work, it has to be this way. And so, as it comes together, and we do our part and start to fit as pieces in this great puzzle, then we have this big picture of the family of Yahweh, the administration of Yahweh, who has this scepter of righteousness that will bring peace, not only here on earth, but also to the entire universe. And that's what we're training for as the world prepares for war. Praise Yahweh. Now, verse 65 here, he says, now he's talking about Revelations. He's reading in Revelations 18 and talking about the prophecy that was shown here with the great mountain that was cast into the sea, burning with fire, was cast into the sea. And of course, remember those definitions of those words, sea, multitudes, peoples, nations, and tongues, languages, and so forth. In verse 65, he says, and the third part of the sea became blood. That word blood there is not like that's flowing through your veins, but it actually, as you see in verse 66, means death. Death for the creatures. And if he talked about, in Chile, he talks about the article here, we brought that out in the news during that time period of the mass amount of marine life, sea life, that was washing ashores on the beaches. And if you look at, you can still like Google or look online and find out the mass animal deaths that took place. I mean, there's a huge list of them. What took place in Chile was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But there was, we had just up north, up in Anson, I believe, or Albany. No, Anson, I think, a lake up there. They had a huge die-off of the fish in there, and they just bloop, bloop, floated to the top of the water and washed off to the shore. But interestingly enough, I think it was a recent report came out the 3rd of November that contrary to what Trump's officials or administration is saying, that what the House of Yahweh said many years ago, all the way back in 06, 07, that mankind is the primary cause for global warming. Because they blame these fish die-offs on El Nino and El Niña and all these things. Well, what's causing all these shifts and changes in the firmament and the jet streams and so forth? Well, it's the activities of these beings that are here on earth, because our sins, yes, can reach up into heavens. It doesn't stay here in our bodies and on the earth. No, everything that comes out of us, right now, we're giving off moisture. When we breathe out, we're breathing out moisture. When you breathe in, you're breathing in moisture that somebody else has breathed out. And everything else. And someone can take a scanner in this room and do some type of a bacterial swab or something like that, or air test, and you'll pick up thousands of different. There's, what do you call that? Not dander. Well, there's probably dander too. Skin cells in the air. Now you multiply that by 14 million people in the city, 5 million people in the city, 125,000 people in the city, and think about what you put yourself into when you go into these places that we don't really need to be in if we don't really have to be. And that's why Yahweh says we have to do things that bring forth protection, because the earth is defiled and the fish are suffering this death because of mankind's sins. We will too if we don't trust in Yahweh and hold fast to Him. Well, let's move forward here. In verse 78 here on page 178, Pastor says, the scientists are now learning things that we knew were factual 40 years ago and told them. We told them this. We know how Yahweh created the earth. We know why Yahweh created the earth. And we know He doesn't lie because His words comes to pass. And if you remember, the reason why Yahweh created not only the earth, but why He created mankind to put on earth, was because of concern for His creation. Concern for what He saw His sons and His daughters doing. What He saw the diseases building in their bodies and spreading throughout one planet to the next, to the next, to the next universe, to the next galaxy, to the next, And he said the only way to stop this is through an administration, a priesthood. Because my sons, my daughters, it's not interesting to them. Coming to Sabbath, it's boring. Going to the feast, not interested. So Yahweh says, well, I'll make mankind in my image and my likeness, and through training, through hardship, allowing them to have the carnal mind, allowing them in a lot of cases to go through what my sons and daughters already did, and bringing them out of that, and they see the change in their life and start to have a zeal and a passion for righteousness and a hatred for that old way, then I know that they'll eventually develop this great peace, as Psalms 119, 165 says, in their hearts for the laws of Yahweh, and nothing will ever, ever cause them to turn away from it. And in that, the Malachim and all those who are going astray right now they will know that my sons and my daughters will have their glory firmly set in the heavens as well. And that's, speaking of us, men, we will eventually get to that point, because we will prove ourselves obedient to Yahweh's laws on the day that our high priest and pastor goes forth in power. And we have a great opportunity, and it should be a great joy to go through this suffering, to go through this test, to go through these trials, and to train, because it's not given to anybody else. It's ours. It's ours for the taking if we want it. And Yahweh is offering it to us. So don't let any man deceive you. Hold fast to Yahweh and His laws, because these great secrets are being revealed right now. We have a high priest who sits at Yahweh's right hand, who's working with the house of Yahweh, working with the one sent, guiding this house as the high priest does. It's a part of his duty, protecting this house, and also revealing to us things that were hidden for thousands of years, that even the prophets desire to see.